And please take as much information as you can. Maureen, they're all yours. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I represent the program director for the National Security Forum in Nevada. So we're dedicated to promoting civil discourse on challenging national security topics. And we can't think of a better group to engage than the next generation of policy leaders in this country. You certainly are off to a good start with your classes here at Reno High. So we're thrilled to be able to be with you today. So this year we have the pleasure of having faculty from George Mason University in Virginia. So back in close to Washington, D.C. So if you ever have an interest, I know you're all seniors, correct? Okay, well, think about your master's program. Perhaps you will consider going to the Schar School of Public Policy and Government in George Mason. It was a fabulous institution with lots of great programs. So with that, I'm going to just roll right into this. The purpose of this program is really just to be able to give you a little bit more information as you go out and navigate the world that is at war. This war in Ukraine is affecting all of us every day and will continue to have a major impact on your lives as you go out, all of us, but particularly those who are interested in studying government. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor McGlinchey. He's going to give us just 10 minutes of sort of the background of the situation in Ukraine and the war. You have maps for those in the other classroom. I'll bring up the maps on the screen shortly. You have maps in front of you that show some of the troop movement and what we mean by Eurasia. All of this material will be available online on the National Security website. We'll post everything by tomorrow. So with that, Eric, please take it away.
Great. First, is the sound okay on your end?
Yes.
Okay, great. Very good. So I'll be addressing the question that, why certain post-Soviet states, particularly why the Central Asian states, and I guess you have a map around you somewhere. You can find the Central Asian states: Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. They're kind of sandwiched in between Russia and China, Afghanistan, if you're looking on the map. The question I want to ask is, why have these post-Soviet states remained neutral, whereas other states, for example, Belarus in particular, but also places not too far away like Syria, why have they supported Moscow in Russia's aggression, Russia's war in Ukraine? And just by way of background, I should say up front, I'm not a Ukraine specialist. I'm a Central Asia scholar, comparative political scientist. I lived in Russia for 2 years in the 90s. I'm a climber. Why is that important? Well, Russia's kind of flat and I got bored of living in Russia. So I ended up looking on a map to find mountains, and I found mountains in Central Asia. I got on a train in Moscow, and 4 days later I was in Central Asia, and I've been researching Central Asia ever since. I study Central Asian authoritarian rule. And currently I'm looking at soft power in Central Asia. This is a Department of Defense, US government supported project comparing soft power of the United States, Russia, and China. So really when I look at Ukraine, I look at it through the lens of Central Asia. And again, the question I want to address is, why are Central Asian countries relatively neutral towards Russia's war in Ukraine, whereas places like Belarus or Syria are much more positive? So I'll divide my presentation into 3 parts. The first part is going to look at Russia's presence in Central Asia. And this really sets up the puzzle. Russia has a massive presence in Central Asia. So one would think, given this massive presence and the degree of dependency of Central Asia on Russia, Central Asian countries would have no choice but to be supportive of Russia. So that'll be the first thing I'll talk about. Next, as time permits, I'll go over Central Asia's neutral stance. towards the war that is not supportive, but also they haven't really come out against. But the fact that they're not supportive, I think, is quite surprising. And then lastly, I'll conclude with what I think is a plausible explanation for why Central Asian countries, in contrast to, say, Belarus and Syria, have been able to remain neutral. So those are the three parts of the presentation. Let me just give you a brief thumbnail sketch of what the Russian presence in Central Asia looks like. Just a few data points to paint a picture here. In 2010, in Kyrgyzstan, there were these deadly ethnic riots, and Kyrgyzstan, the government at the time, immediately turned to Moscow and asked for support. And this is the reason why I bring this up, is this is an example of how Central Asian dependency on Russia works. At that point, Russia didn't intervene. I was actually in Kyrgyzstan at the time, walking through a town called Osh, and the city was literally on fire. The bodies in the street, it was really quite traumatic. So one can understand why Kyrgyzstan asked Moscow for support to put this down. Eventually, the riots quelled down, but this was in the absence of Russian support. In 2022, earlier this year, there were also riots in Kazakhstan. And in this case, Moscow actually did intervene. The government in Kazakhstan asked for support, and Russia sent troops into Kazakhstan. And one would think, Kazakhstan needed Russian support. And then, when the war came about just a month later in Ukraine, you would think that because Kazakhstan received that support, Kazakhstan would be supportive of Russia with this war. And that's actually not the case. A couple other examples of this dependent relationship with Russia. Central Asia has two military bases that host the Russian military. So there's one in Kant in Kyrgyzstan. There's another one in Dushanbe, the capital of Tajikistan. The Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, where Russia launches all of its rockets. Another example of this close relationship with Russia. Economically, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are members of the Eurasian Economic Union. More broadly, when we take into account Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Turkmenistan, remittances, that is money from Central Asian migrants working in Russia, make up between 1/3 and 1/10 of these countries' GDPs. So economically incredibly dependent on Russia. And then with the map that you have in front of you, if you look at that border between Kazakhstan and Russia, that border is 7,700 kilometers long. It's the longest land border in the world. It's actually 3 times the length of the border that Russia has with Ukraine. So if you think about exposure to Russian troops, no country is more exposed to Russian troops than Kazakhstan. Right? They could just literally go across the border very easily. It's a massive border, and there's no way that Kazakhstan could defend that border. So there's an extreme degree of vulnerability and dependency of Central Asian countries on Russia. Yet none of these countries have come out in support. In fact, actually, it's been notable how silent they have been on this war and their lack of willingness to come out to defend Moscow. So I'll just give you one example of this. In March of this year, there was a UN vote to denounce the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And rather than going against this vote, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan, they abstained. Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan didn't vote at all. Whereas countries like Belarus and Syria and North Korea voted to go against this denunciation of Russia. So what explains this? Just to give you a little bit more flavor of the kind of neutral stance. Kyrgyzstan, the president of Kyrgyzstan said in March, quote, "We're a little country. We don't have sufficient influence to stop the conflict. Therefore, we must take a neutral position." Again, no support for Russia. In the case of Kazakhstan, the president of Kazakhstan said, "We call on both sides, both states to make utmost efforts to pursue a dialogue to work towards a peaceful settlement. There's no other way." Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, here the presidents have been a little bit silent, but it's notable that there's been no support articulated in favor of Russia. So there's been very little pro-Russia. There's been a little bit of pro-Ukraine. So Kazakhstan has actually sent fairly substantial medical supplies to the Ukrainian government. Within Central Asian society more broadly, there's actually been a fair amount of support for Ukraine. And within the Central Asian press, there's also been a fair amount of support for Ukraine. And this is notable because the Central Asian press is not free. The state, should it want to, could easily crack down on these statements in support of Ukraine. So what explains this? And this is where I'll wrap up because I'm at 8 minutes. What explains this neutrality of Central Asian states, even to a certain degree, I would say, even a little bit of support for Ukraine, whereas places like Belarus and Syria have been very pro-Russia. So what I would argue here is that the Central Asian states, unlike Belarus and Syria, they can get away with neutrality paradoxically because Russia doesn't perceive any threats from them. They've got nowhere to go. Again, if you look at the map, Central Asian states, unlike Belarus, which is right on the border with Europe, right? Central Asian states can't go anywhere. They can't, I mean, I suppose they could go to China, right? But China is actually fairly supportive of Russia. They're not going to go to Europe. There's no geopolitical threat from these Central Asian states. And I think ironically, because Russia doesn't perceive a threat from these Central Asian states, it frees up these Central Asian states to take a neutral position, whereas Syria and Belarus, places that could go elsewhere, could move away from Russia, they are compelled to demonstrate their loyalty to Russia because Russia actually does understand that these countries have an alternative. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the next presentation, and I very much look forward to your questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor McGlinchey. So we are very honored to have Susan. Walk this way. Susan Malone is one of the board members for the National Security Forum, and she'll give you a little bit of perspective of some things that you may need to think about on the ground. Susan has an esteemed career in international justice, including working extensively on war crimes. So I know that's been a hot topic that's been in the news a lot lately. So Susan, if you just give us your short perspective.
Real quickly, it's an honor to be here talking to all of you. You guys are the future leaders of America. And I'm very proud to be here and share with you. I was with the United Nations War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, the Netherlands. The War Crimes Tribunal was set up originally to investigate the allegations of war crimes in the former Yugoslavia. All three sides, the Serbs, the Bosniaks, and the Croats, all committed war crimes against mostly civilians, sometimes against surrendered military from their opposite side, mostly against civilians. I mean, you look at the mass graves. So what we did was go in and prepare the cases against the senior leaders, both in the military and in the form of the government that perpetrated, orchestrated, led, and advocated for war crimes against the civilians in the former Yugoslavia on the opposite side. So, we did the mass grave exhumations and did the forensic scientists to study what happened, when it happened, and who did it. And then, as you know, in your history and reading, we then extradited or captured people that we call them the pickpicks, the persons indicted for war crimes. Through our courts, we got indictments for war crimes against Croat leaders, Serbian leaders, and some of the Bosniak leaders, both civilian and military, for these war crimes. So war crimes have been around for a long time through history. If you go back and you read the history of the Romans, everybody is accused of crimes against it, a way to terrorize the populations. So now we have laws that govern law of land warfare, law of war, what things you can and cannot do. If somebody surrenders, if a combatant surrenders, drops their weapons, they've now surrendered. They're no longer a combatant. You can take them prisoner, but you can't abuse them, mistreat them, or kill them, or torture them. That's a war crime. It's a crime within the military code of justice too. So some of those things, all of those things we investigated. One of the things that we were able to do for the first time ever was to introduce rape as a war crime and have it accepted under the UN laws, the laws of humanity, as a war crime. So those are some of the things you're seeing in today in the news, in in many different countries, but especially in European countries. We're having trouble now. So we're looking at that. There's teams on the ground now. You'll see pictures of some of these investigators who are going in there investigating the burial sites and looking at phone footage that people took of the allegations of war crimes. So it's a subject that's continuing, and you'll hear more about it in the news. Remember, information warfare, some of it may be propaganda, some of it may not be propaganda, and that's where you're sorting out the truth.
Excellent, thank you, Susan. So that gives you a little bit of perspectives from two experts. One who's looked at the broader picture for the entire region, and one who understands a lot of what's going on the ground. So this is your opportunity to ask questions, both from here and from our fellow classrooms across the hall. Sorry. So with that, we will open it up for student questions. We'll start in the classroom here. If you have something in writing, you can pass it to Mr. Peters and he'll put it in the chat box. Otherwise, project and raise your hand and I can take questions here. Question? Yes.
So I was wondering about the,
Talk loud.
oh, okay,
She'll hear you.
okay,
I can hear you, speak up.
okay, so I was wondering about the tribunals, for like, trying people on war crimes. How do those trials differ from like a typical US criminal trial?
Well, first of all, you have a panel of judges that sit and listen to the evidence at hand. The evidence is introduced. You have investigators and we have lawyers on both sides. I mean, the accused has a right to representation. It's, they use probably the French system. It's the European laws, but they're the same laws that we have. They just maybe attack it a little bit differently in a courtroom, but they are able to argue in the courtroom, both sides. You have the prosecutors and they present the evidence that the investigators gather on the ground. We can do it with written testimony, testimony of witnesses, same way the witnesses come. The defense has the right to see the information, discovery, they get to see the information. They get their chance of questioning the witnesses, they get the chance to provide their information, and then the judges, there's not a jury as such as a panel of judges, and they deliberate, and then they decide if guilt or innocence of the person. So that's the way the system works for the International War Crimes Tribunal.
Excellent. Questions from Mr. Carlin's room? Do you have questions? How about Mr. Peavy? Okay, you guys are on mute, so if you have questions, you're gonna have to project. Come off mute. Back to here. So questions? Yes.
Can you explain the multiple Minsk agreements between Russia and Ukraine?
Say that again.
The Minsk agreement between Russia and Ukraine is why
Yes.
after multiple did they not?
So, Professor McGlinchey, would you explain that?
Yeah, again, I'm not 100% expert on Ukraine, I have to confess, but I think I think there's certain let me get back to you on that. let me pull that up because there's different parts of it, and I don't want to misspeak. Let me pull it up in a second, and then I'll get back.
Okay, we'll circle back on that question. If Minsk was the settlement for the ceasefire in 2014. Questions here? Other questions?
I have something to throw out for the group. When you're looking at your history and you're studying, you have the professor talking about Central Asia and the countries in Mongolia. There's a small book that I would recommend for you all to read. I think I can get the title correct. It's Genghis Khan and How He Changed the Modern World. It's a really wonderful read when you see the Mongols and how they came in. Remember, they came in through Russia and Kiev, the Prince of Kiev, that was old Russia. And for 300 years, the Golden Horde occupied a lot of Russia. So what you see is Russia to the east of that wasn't as well developed as Kiev and that area back in the 1400s. Read that book. Read a lot of books that talks about the interrelationship of Central Asia and those European countries and Russia and how it influenced history.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right, so I just pulled up my notes on the Minsk agreement. So that it's a little bit complicated, and part of the reason why I was hesitating is there's 2 rounds of this. In essence, right? So this was an agreement in which the governments of Ukraine and Russia came together. In essence, it essentially recognized the frozen conflict. And I don't know if you have a map up there in front of you, but if you look in the eastern part of Ukraine, we've got Donetsk and Luhansk. It basically recognized the frozen conflict and gave self-governance to these. And this is actually Minsk II, not Minsk I. So it gets a little bit complicated here. But it recognized the frozen conflict and allowed for a ceasefire. But it's funny because I talked to my Ukrainian colleagues and I talked to my Russian colleagues, and both sides view this agreement differently. And I think that's part of the reason why we haven't had a lasting peace. They both sides see in this agreement different things. And ultimately, as you see, it wasn't, it was 2 rounds of it, 2014 and 2015. Ultimately, this wasn't able to prevent Russia from making the claim that Ukraine wasn't abiding by the agreement, and moreover, was denying local self-rule for these 2 breakaway regions in Ukraine.
And one of the things that's been reported on a lot lately, and for those who are in the other classrooms, I highly recommend that you follow this site, which is the Institute for the Study of War. They post the troop movements maps every day, and this was Friday's map. So one thing about the Minsk agreement was the Russians didn't honor it now. And that has been invoked a lot lately in the discussions about would Ukraine be willing to go to a peace negotiation with Russia. They're very skeptical. They were in a ceasefire situation, not a full-blown peace treaty, but certainly in a pseudo ceasefire situation with Russia because of the Minsk agreement. Ukraine more or less honored that as best they could within inside of that area or outside of that area, but then Russia abrogated that and invaded, and now there's no trust that Russia would honor another agreement like that. You had a question?
Yes. Can you explain how Russia regards the sovereignty of Eastern European countries and Central Asian countries?
Professor Litchi.
All right, so this is more in my wheelhouse. And I don't have to parse the different Minsk agreements, Minsk I, Minsk II. Yeah, so I mean, this is a great question. Russia has been very willing to violate the sovereignty of multiple states, right? So we have the example of Russia going into Georgia, recognizing breakaway or quote unquote breakaway republics in Georgia. There has been a lot of talk. In fact, Putin has threatened Kazakhstan with the possibility of taking over parts of northern Kazakhstan. There's a famous Russian writer named Solzhenitsyn, Russian writer named Solzhenitsyn, who you may have heard of. In addition to being known as a dissident, he was also a very prominent Russian nationalist, and he always argued that northern Kazakhstan should be part of Russia, and that has found articulation in the Russian government. So Russia very much ascribes to this idea that there is this near abroad, and Russia is able to operate in this near abroad. And in fact, Russia can, according to Moscow's stance, protect Russian-speaking populations, ethnic Russians, irredentist populations in the near abroad, and so far as go into these areas and take over territory, which has been recognized by the international community, the United Nations, as being part of the sovereignty of other states. So Russia doesn't think very highly of sovereignty, particularly when it comes to the near abroad. It thinks very highly of its own sovereignty, but it very much ascribes to this idea of might makes right. So it's I suppose even more paradoxical that a lot of these Central Asian countries are not opposing because they are vulnerable and they understand that Russia could roll across the border and take territory.
Excellent, thank you. Questions from, okay,
So if these Central Asian countries are vulnerable to Russia, why is it not worthwhile for them to appease Russia by recognizing or by essentially being on Russia's side of the conflict?
Yeah, I mean, so that's the puzzle that I've been thinking a lot about, and again, not as a non-Ukraine specialist, my view into Ukraine is from Central Asia, and it really is surprising, right? It's surprising that these countries, particularly Kazakhstan, which is not only vulnerable because of the land border that you see. I mean, Kazakhstan asked Moscow to send troops in. To help put down an uprising at the beginning of this year. Kazakhstan really needed Russia, and so it's very unusual that they're not lining up. My only answer, and in fact, I would welcome an alternative answer that you might be able to provide. My only answer is that because of their position of weakness, because Russia doesn't feel threatened by Kazakhstan, doesn't feel threatened by Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, or Uzbekistan, Russia is willing to tolerate their silence. Whereas, why did Russia go into Ukraine? Russia went into Ukraine because Ukraine, again, I'm treading into territory where I'm not expert, but Russia went into Ukraine because Ukraine was moving closer and closer to the West. Central Asia can't move closer and closer to the West. It's stuck between China and Russia. So I think it's ironically because of this weakness, this geopolitical kind of being surrounded, that Central Asian countries actually have a little bit of latitude and not vocally supporting the war. But I agree with you. It's unusual. It's surprising. And if you guys have any alternative hypotheses, I'm all ears. I would welcome to hear what your thoughts are.
Eric, are any of the Central Asian countries poised to join China and then be a threat to Russia in any way? I mean, is that a geopolitical issue that Russia has to face with any of these countries and China's influence?
Yeah, Richard, that's a really interesting question. That's part of what we're looking at in this Department of Defense project. China has made a big move in Central Asia, and there's this Belt and Road Initiative where China is investing heavily, and not just in Central Asia, but in Africa, the Middle East as well, to increase its economic influence. What's so interesting about China, though, is China is okay and comfortable on the economic end, but has been pretty hands-off on the political end. And I think China's made a calculation that it's okay letting Russia take care of the geopolitical mess that often occurs in Central Asia and provide the guarantees of stability, which allows China to invest economically. It's also interesting that while Biden was in, or I don't know if he still is, he was in Asia speaking, recently speaking about Taiwan. China and Russia were doing joint exercises, military exercises. So what we see with Russia and China more and more is this alliance of convenience where they're working together to counterbalance the United States. So I think at the current moment, Russia is not concerned about China, but as you and your students know very well from international relations, these balances of power change, and down the road this could be a real challenge to Russia. Currently it's not, but it certainly could be in the future.
excellent, thank you. Mr. Carlin, Mr. Peavy, do you have questions from your classes? Not seeing any hands raised.
I have a question from one of my students.
Yes.
Lark, would you speak up, please?
Yeah, so you said that Kazakhstan is not really a threat to Russia because they don't have any geopolitical advantage and Russia's dissolved. But you also said that Russia was threatening them and kind of saying like, oh, we could take like all their northern land if we wanted to. But as far as I know, Kazakhstan is not like westernizing as much as Ukraine. So what would you guys focus on doing that one? Like, why would they want to do that one?
I caught about 50% about that of that question, something about Russia threatening Kazakhstan.
I'll rehash your question. Metalark was wondering, since Kazakhstan has no option of kind of westernizing and moving closer to NATO and Western democracies, what is Russia's play with getting more involved in Kazakhstan? Is it irredentism? Are they trying to rebuild their empire? Is it flexing muscle? Is it resources? Is there any reasons why Russia would be more politically or geopolitically involved in Kazakhstan?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question because we have this variation where in 2010 Kyrgyzstan asked for support and Russia didn't go in, and then in 2022 Russia did. There's probably a couple things going on here. One, I think by the time Russia intervened in January 2022, Putin had already decided that he was going into Ukraine. And actually the US government, the Biden administration's reporting on this, or the warnings, the constant warnings that we heard before the run-up that Russia was going to go in, it was actually amazing, right? The Biden administration was saying that this was going to happen. And so a lot of us dismissed it in January, but I think it was pretty clear in retrospect that this was going to happen. And so part of what was going on in Kazakhstan, I think, and if you watch the video footage of it, was this was basically the equivalent of a Russian military parade on Red Square in Moscow, but internationally, right? The flying in of the troops, the demonstration of Russian might. This was a made-for-TV opportunity where Russia could demonstrate its military prowess. And it was scripted. It was scripted beautifully. You have to hand it to the Russian information campaign. It was a very compelling demonstration of Russian power. So part of the reason for why I think Russia went in January 2022 was to capture the international attention and demonstrate, look, we're a power. We can move troops. We're a force to be reckoned with. I think the other thing that was going on here is, in contrast to what was going on in 2010 in Kyrgyzstan, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but in contrast to what was going on in Kyrgyzstan in 2010, at that point, politics in Kyrgyzstan, despite the rise, it was clear who was going to be the president of Kyrgyzstan. In Kazakhstan in 2022, there was a power struggle between two figures, Nazarbayev, the former president, and Tokayev, the current president. And I think what Russia saw was an opportunity to come in and essentially play kingmaker and make sure that Tokayev was able to maintain his power and not be threatened by the former president. And then this elevated Russia's position vis-a-vis Kazakh politics, its ability to act within Kazakhstan, because Tokayev was in essence dependent on Moscow. So I think that was the other thing going on there. In 2022, Russia had the chance to play kingmaker, whereas in 2010 in Kyrgyzstan, it was a foregone conclusion who the next president was going to be.
Very thorough. Thank you very much. Other questions? Mr. Keevy, you have questions? Oh, sorry,
Yeah, Carlos got a question.
So I was more so wondering what's Mongolia's stance in all this, because they're literally sandwiched between Russia and China, and literally have nowhere else to go. So I was wondering how, like, they were wondering if they were supporting either side, if they were remaining neutral, like what would they do?
Yeah, good question. Like Ukraine, I can't claim to be a Mongolia specialist. I mean, Mongolia, I was looking at the UN votes a couple of days ago. I'm not quite sure how Mongolia voted. Mongolia certainly hasn't been supportive, right? It hasn't been among the kind of Belarus, Syria states. I'm not quite sure if it's been openly against. My guess is it's probably been quite careful. But I think Mongolia occupies a somewhat similar position to Central Asia in that it can afford to kind of be quiet and neutral, and neither China or Russia are really going to care. Mongolia is somewhat interesting in the fact that, like Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia has flirted with political reform and democratization. And what's really interesting about your question, from my point of view as the scholar who studies authoritarianism in Central Asia, is what makes Russia even more upset than whether or not these countries are going to align with Russia geopolitically is whether or not these countries are going to become democratic, because that's the real threat for Russia. If Mongolia becomes democratic, and Mongolia again has moved in that direction, it's kind of gone back and forth. If Kyrgyzstan becomes democratic, Kyrgyzstan's moved in that direction, although it's gone back and forth. That presents an alternative model in the Asian part of Eurasia that demonstrates there's other kinds of government, and people in Russia will take notice. One of the really fascinating things with this war is people who are like you, right? They're really educated, younger, late teens, early 20s, who are against this war, have gotten on planes and have gone to places like Central Asia where the society is a little bit more free, and they can criticize the Russian government, and they can just operate and live their lives. So even more than this lack of support for Russia internationally, what Russia really worries about is these pockets of freedom in the Eurasian space that demonstrate to the Russian population, look, you don't have to live this way. In fact, you have an exit option. You can go to Kyrgyzstan and be an IT professional, and still, and also not have to wrestle with your conscience about what's going on with Ukraine. So that's the big threat. That's the big threat for Russia from Central Asia.
Excellent. I think one of the things to think about with Mongolia breaking away from Russia. In 1927, when Russia took over Mongolia, it became the dictator people of Mongolia, they went in there. When you study history, there's a lot of hate. There's a lot of hate in the world. The Russians hated the Mongols for what the Mongols did for 300 years in that part of Russia, and destroying what the Russians believed was their history, their culture, whatever. When they went into Mongolia in 1927, they destroyed every land record, every name record, birth certificates, anything that established the person's identity. So the Mongolians could only use, like, what is your first name? Logan. Okay, you wouldn't have a last name. You'd say, okay, my name is Logan. And that persisted, and they went back to find as many of Genghis Khan's descendants. One of them was a monk in a monastery. Took him away, he disappeared. Anything that had to do with the Mongolian identity, they destroyed. So when Mongolia became independent, they've had this real name search and a search, and they've asked the international community to help them find their heritage. Who am I? What was my family? Then you can trace your family back and say they came to America here. They served, and was their names. You can go back on some of those genealogical sites, and you can find your family history. But the Mongolians can't really do that like we can. They're trying now to reestablish land records, name records, birth records, their personal identity from Mongolia prior to 1927. So remember, as you're studying and you're going on in your studies, and read the history and what caused civilizations to come together. When you're looking at the Ukraine, remember the Crimea. That was a warm water port for the Imperial Russians. They gathered that because they didn't have a really year-round warm water port for their fleet and a way to access information. St. Petersburg isn't really a warm water port. And so there's a lot of history that's tied up in identity with seizing back the Crimea, Odessa, all these areas that played a big role in Imperial Russian history. So, thank you, Susan.
Could I ask a question?
Sure, of course.
Yeah, I mean, and this is for the students, and this is something that I've been puzzling about. I went to school in Russia. I spent my junior year and then the year after college in Russia, and spent a lot of time hanging out with Russian friends, drinking coffee. I may have had a beer or two with them, and so I don't know these folk really well. And so my question is this: how can really smart people in Russia, people your age, how can it be that they support this war? What is it? What's going on that the vast majority of progressive young Russians connected to the internet, with things like VPNs, right? They can get around the censor. why are they supporting this? I was curious. I don't know if you guys have looked at this in your study of Ukraine, but do you guys have any theories for why this is so overwhelmingly popular among the young generation in Russia?
Maybe possible political beliefs. They may agree with what Putin is doing and supporting it wholeheartedly. Or they're probably afraid of like prosecution from their own government because, you know, with these political views, they're like really controversial, and it can come to an extent where it could be life-threatening if you're on the opposition of the government. Yeah.
Did you hear that, Professor McGlinchey?
One, I think I heard two things. One, that there could be actually people actually, you know, for some reason they believe in it, right? Which I think is absolutely true. And then the other one was this point that it could be dangerous to say something. So even if you didn't believe in it, right, it could be dangerous to say something against it, which is also true. I mean, there's all these stories about Russians gathering around the kitchen table and then literally unplugging the radio that used to be plugged into the wall because they were afraid that it was a listening device, where you would only articulate your true sentiment in the safety of your kitchen. And at that point, you'd only do it once you knew that no one was listening in. So it may be that actually a lot of people are against the war, but they're just petrified of going out and saying anything, because if you did, you may end up in jail, or you may end up even worse. Yeah.
So, Mr. Carlin, Mr. Kuby, do you have comments, responses from your classes?
Well, one of my ideas, not ideas, but one of the reasons I think is kind of like with,
Didn't quite hear you.
Come closer, Alex.
can I just walk up?
Yeah, come on over.
On over.
Hi. So maybe like group things with like technology and people having access to social media, that a lot of these younger generations are looking at facts on the internet and believing them and following them, because many of these younger children are also doing it. So it's kind of like following the sheep kind of thing. And then also being that Russia has for years like spread fake news propaganda and also killed people when they speak out against the government, it can kind of be like a generational trauma where it's like you don't speak out like you said.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
So how many of you get most of your news from social media? Oh, well, not very many. So there you go, Professor McGlinchey. Not everybody lives and breathes by social media, but not having access to it, not being able to cut through what's being put out in Russia could be a major factor.
Yeah, and I'll just share one personal story that relates to this last point. That I didn't catch your name, but that you were making. I speak Russian, and I listen to the Russian media. I try to listen to the independent media, because at this point it's very hard for me to tolerate the official state media. But every now and then I'll watch the Russian state media, and I was watching a report that the state media put out about the atrocities that Ukrainians were committing against school children in Donetsk, and I found myself, saying to myself, this is terrible. How could the Ukrainians do this? This is awful. I had to catch myself, right? It was so compelling the way that the Russian state media, this isn't social media, the way the Russian state media was reporting on it was so compelling and so slick that I myself, sitting in Alexandria, Virginia, thought for a second, oh my gosh, how terrible the Ukrainians are, when in fact, of course, this was all propaganda. So I can totally see why people watching that might come to the conclusion that, yeah, we have to support Moscow for what they're doing.
Yes.
Can you explain what the post-Soviet Union influence is in places that were once part of the USSR?
The post-Soviet.
What are the post-Soviet influences in those countries that were originally part of the former Soviet Union?
Yeah. Yeah, interesting question. So again, my window is through Central Asia, and yeah, I've spent time in Estonia, I've spent time in Latvia, Lithuania, spent time in Ukraine. I don't claim to be expert on these countries, but what I can say about Central Asia is the influence is massive. The influence is absolutely massive. So we're talking about social media. Some Russians are on Facebook. Actually, a lot of Russians are on Facebook, but a lot of them are on this platform called Kontakte, which is a Russian platform. All Russian TV is pervasive throughout Central Asia. People speak Russian fairly well in Central Asia because a lot of Central Asians work in Russia. Actually, a lot of Mongolians work in Russia. When you watch movies, to a certain extent, they'll watch Hollywood movies, but even more so, a lot of them are going to watch Russian movies, even more so than their own Central Asian movies. A lot of Central Asians, we've done survey work, a lot of Central Asians admire Putin more than just any other political leader in the world. So the influence is immense. For a little bit in the early 2000s, we thought that the influence was going to decline. And I suppose to a certain extent it's declined since 1991, but I'm shocked to how pronounced the influence is. Culturally, economically, politically, it's very much there. And while a lot of us, including myself, thought it was going to begin to dissipate, it's still shocking to me how pervasive the Russian influence is.
Thanks. Mr. Clark, do you have any other questions for this group?
I think we still have one.
Oh.
Over here.
Oh, sorry. My apologies. Hold on, Richard.
I was wondering if you think that it's possible that Kazakhstan is trying to align itself with China because of, a lot of Belt and Road initiatives are basically infrastructure projects through Kazakhstan. And I'm wondering if you think that it's possible that they're trying to align themselves more closely with China in the way that China is also neutral, abstaining the vote at the UN, or if, because they're currently so economically dependent on Russia that maybe they're trying to align themselves more closely with China, who might potentially be a better, more kind partner in trading and politics.
Yeah, really interesting question, and I'm afraid that my answer may be more complicated than you want. When we talk about Kazakhstan, just like when we talk about the United States or we talk about Nevada, Virginia, I think we have to differentiate between the people and the government. So let me first take a crack at the government. The Kazakh government is very closely connected to China, and China has cultivated dependency relations with the Kazakh government. Given loans, for example, to Kazakhstan or infrastructure projects in ways that enrich a lot of the Kazakh political elite and enmesh them essentially in a network of corruption. So the Kazakh state is very close to Kazakhstan. I'm sorry, to China. But when you ask Kazakhs about China, there's a lot of chauvinism against China. A lot of Kazakhs aren't particularly favorable towards China. There's this, rumor that Chinese men are coming into Kazakhstan to marry Kazakh women. Or the Chinese are coming across the border to take Kazakh land. There's also this reality, not rumor, but reality that Kazakhs have been repressed in Northwest China. So I don't know if you guys have looked at, the re-education camps in Northwest China, re-education camps for the Muslim minority population in China. It's not just Uyghurs, there's actually Kazakhs who have fallen into those camps as well. And there's been protests against China. So to answer your question, yes, the government has moved more closely towards China, but the population in Kazakhstan is not ready at this point to be more aligned towards China than towards Russia.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor McGlinchey. Thank you, Susan Malone, our guests here. Thank you, students, for listening to us. We wish you well in your future endeavors, and please do consider becoming our next generation of leaders. We need more of you out there. So thank you. And thank you very much, Eric, for participating today.
Thanks for having me. Bye, guys. If you guys have any questions about George Mason, please feel free to email me. You can Google me, and I'll get back to you. I hope to see you in Virginia. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
I got two packages for Dan Smith and